So I was studying architecture, and then I decided to quit architectural school, and I started working in areas of housing, actually refugee housing, and which turned eventually into a form of social engagement or activist engagement. And then that's exactly the need I felt for using media that was more than just writing or speaking, or an audiovisual those days was, essentially it was slideshows, and films were not really affordable or convenient. And then that kind of progressed into wanting to learn filmmaking. So that's actually how I got into films from architecture. The only two ways of learning how to make films was either to assist somebody, work with somebody, or go to the only film school that was existing here. I tried contacting some filmmakers whose work I really appreciated, but they didn't have, obviously, a place for somebody who didn't know anything about films. So then that was the only option left. So I kind of had to. Yes, well, exploring ways of communicating is what I would say. Theater was one option which I was not good at, or it didn't attract me. And if you're working in the field in a way, which I did a lot with various groups, with some political groups, some advocacy work, that kind of thing. So this seemed to be documenting visually or audiovisually and then sharing that made sense. My desire to make films or to learn how to make films came from the work I was doing, which was primarily engaging with various groups that were either fighting for a certain cause or organizing against something or organizing for something. So that could include demolitions or displacement. Those days slum displacement was a big thing. Fighting for housing rights was a very big issue, and I was connected with that. So in Gujarat, the Narmada Dam was coming up, so there was a huge resistance building up to that. So I was engaged partly with that. So those were the inspirations. I mean, in the sense, it's a default extension of what your work is. So in '87, there was this fairly devastating. It was a culmination of 4 years of drought in Kutch, and in this particular region, which is extensively a pastoral area, the Bani region. So it only survives on cattle herding, and that was being impacted hugely. So there was this huge migration of cattle from that area, and we decided to make a documentary on that, which essentially looked at the impact of sustained scarcity, ecological kind of devastation due to development, and how it impacts one form of economic activity and therefore cultural activity, and therefore so it came about like that. Then, as I said, I was kind of engaged with the Narmada thing, so we did a fairly long documentary on the first three villages that had been displaced and partly resettled then. So it's been like that. I learned only on celluloid. There was no video. There was, but only Doordarshan. So, but the first documentary I ever made was on video. So for me, that shift was already done. Uh, I think it allows for a certain amount of freedom, which celluloid would not allow. And particularly in the kind of documentary that I do, I'm not really, in any case, very enamored by this whole celluloid business and the romance of the celluloid. I mean, to me, it's a tool. and whatever tool is convenient and easily available is to be used. So yeah, it's been wonderful. I mean, earlier I had to keep on traveling to Bombay. I live in Ahmedabad. To travel to Bombay for any little post production I had to do, I can now do it sitting in my, small office. So yeah, I find it very liberating. The one thing that I've felt over the past few years is, and it's to do with the digital revolution in a sense, is that while it's become easy to make films, and because it's easy, people don't put in the kind of effort they need to in both thinking about the subject that they're going to talk about and the craft. It's like you have Word, Microsoft Word now, but that doesn't mean that you can write well. In films, everybody thinks that because you can shoot, you put together anything, you can. So I think that has become part of the problem, and also most of the films in certain sectors are judged on content only, not on what the film is, the craft, or whatever you can call it. I think that is a bit unfortunate. When I joined the Film Institute, they had introduced what was then called the integrated course. Uh, so for 2 years, you have to do everything, and in the third year, you specialized either in camera or editing, and direction was a post diploma option. So for 2 years, we did everything, which is closer to what you do in documentary filmmaking. I do sound, I do editing, I can at a pinch shoot. At least I'm equipped to do that. So my training in the institute, in that sense, was much more geared to documentary, and it's from our batch and around that a lot of very good documentary filmmakers came out in India. So Ranjan Palit or Samira Jain or whatever, a whole lot of people who graduated and wanted to do documentaries as a matter of choice rather than fiction. So I think we were lucky enough to be trained in that manner. I really haven't of late done much work. I mean, I only work with people I know, for one. So if I'm editing somebody's film, I guess I have the liberty to say just leave it with me, and I don't want you sitting on the edit, and I do a cut, show it, discuss it. So for me, it's not so difficult, but it also means that I do less work. I mean, it's a given. It's not very difficult to role play in that sense. If I'm helping somebody to do audio, I know that's what I have to do. And if that person wants some opinion on something else, I can give it, but otherwise I'll do the audio as best as I can. Editing becomes a bit more difficult because you are actually constructing the film. A film commissioned for an exhibition that was happening in Bombay called The State of Housing, which was essentially looking at the housing crisis in independent India, and tracing the roots of that crisis, or the initiatives that had been taken over the last 70 years, what's happening currently, what are the policies that impacted housing and the direction in which housing solutions were going, etc., etc. They wanted a film to be a part of the exhibition, and so they managed to get funding from Tata Trust for the film. And originally we had decided to do one long film which would be shown adjacent to the exhibition. Eventually, I think 2 months before the exhibition was to open, it so happened that the design of the exhibition and the space was such that they had to make a cabin with a booth within the exhibition space to screen the film. So we actually changed the structure of the film 2 months before because for one, nobody was going to watch it. At least so I thought, a 40-minute film or 45-minute film in an exhibition space, where everything else is, it's not secluded, it's not comfortable to sit. So I constructed a film which was episodic in a sense, and the key aspects related to housing. So displacement, migration, tenure, land tenure, issues about legality, gender issues, so things like the main key issues. And each issue was a chapter for about 3-4 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Thinking was that even if you caught 5 minutes of the film, you would at least get one idea from the film. And then all these issues were also kind of looked at in the exhibition at length. So there was then this connection between the film and the exhibition. And the film was largely based on people, talking to people who were in a situation or in a given situation. And then that was put into a context by people who articulated, theorized, whatever. So that was the structure of that film. And then we decided that we need to make a slightly different film which could be shown just as a film, independent of the exhibition. Initially, the exhibition had 3 curators, right? Rahul Mehrotra, there was Girish Shah, no, Ranjit Hoskote, and there was Kaivan Mehta. So initially, I asked, and this was what? This was in April. The exhibition was in February the next year, for a brief as to what they were looking for in the narrative, because it's a huge subject. How do you deal with it? So over the next 2 months, we tried and worked out a kind of, not a script, but a flow of idea kind of thing. So how do you look at it in terms of history? What is the historical timeline? What happened during that period? And then we kind of slowly zoomed into what we need to shoot, not in the sense of exactly question answers, but what kind of area should we go and shoot in to get material that would fit into this. Secondly, we had decided that we should shoot in as much of India as we can, so it doesn't appear localized and we really didn't have time to shoot. We had only 2 months within it to shoot, and then so I prepared a template, and I found 2 teams to shoot in different parts of the country. Navroz and I have worked together for 30 years now, so we know what. The rest I had never worked with, but as I said, the template was kind of critical in at least suggesting both visual and content outlines. And then we just went with it, and then there was obviously we got some shooting, there was some feedback as to what we should do, but I guess we were lucky in the sense that the people we selected delivered. This is the first film I've done which is funded in that sense. I had done a couple of other films which were commissioned with limited budget, but otherwise it's all mostly been my own resources. So, and I've never even tried, unfortunately, to look for funding, so I am not the best person to answer that. But I know from friends that funding has become more of an issue now than, say, it was when my colleagues started making films. There was this time when Channel 4 and BBC were putting in a lot of money in, and actually if you study the documentary films in India, that was the period when the most substantial work was done. This was the 80s. And now PSBT is one source which is consistently, they might not be paying a lot of money, but they at least provide some resources to do fairly independent work. And there's tons of money available if you want to do government films or sponsored films like that. We did crowdfunding in '87, when we were doing the famine film. So some friends gave tapes. My father would give some money, somebody else would give something else. We convinced the camera guy to give his camera for free. So in documentary films, crowdfunding has always been there. In feature films also earlier, when what's called the parallel cinema. So everybody would help out. You made films I made a feature film in 12, 13 lakhs. So which had 60 days of shoot, 60 locations. So you don't count the additional money that you might have spent if people hadn't helped out with things. So in certain endeavors, by nature there is crowdfunding.